In Admin Lesson 1, we're going to go over user setup in TrackerRMS. If you go up and click on the Tools icon in Tracker, in the bottom right-hand side, you'll have the User Setup section. So this is going to be built out of a few different blocks here. But where you click on Users, this is where you can look and see what users you have on the system. So if we have one on here, you'll look and see that we have the number of licenses that have been acquired or allocated, and then you have the number of users that are being used. So in this case, if we wanted to add a second user on, we would need to click on the blue Buy User Licenses button. What this would do is it would pop up an on-screen message. This would allow you to put in your information for your username. And then you can click the drop-down to indicate how many licenses you would like to add to the system. So by entering this in, it is authorizing the purchase invoicing of the additional licenses. If you hit Buy Credits, what it will do is it will send an email to our accounts team, and they can amend the invoice and payments accordingly. So if we hit Cancel here, when you refresh the screen, you'll notice that now we have 1 out of 2 users available. So now we can hit the Add New User button to add a second user onto the system. So when we hit the Add New User button, we'll see that we have all of our basic information. So the username or the email is going to be the email address of the user that we're putting on. The user group is going to be the particular user group that they're assigned into. So on the system, out of the box, you'll have an administrator and a recruiter user group, but you can add additional groups if there's different levels of access or privileges you want to give to them. So we'll put this one into the recruiter user group, and we'll put the email address for this particular user here. Now the first name is where we're going to be putting in their first name. Surname is where we would put the last name in, and the full name is going to display their name on the system. The position is where we can enter in their title or their position. And then the address, location, and the 4 fields beneath it, these are going to be pieces of information that you're putting on that can be built into tags or templates on the system. So if you want that information to be displayed, this is where you would enter it in. On the right-hand side, the department is going to be where you can indicate departments if they have been built out on the system. So this is where you could split out users into different departments like sales, recruiting, or if there were different locations. So this can be built out under lists and statuses, but in here we'll just leave it as none. Manager is where you can tag that person so that they can roll up to another person. So if we wanted TrackerRMS Academy to be this person's manager, you can indicate it in here. And then managerial view will allow you to say in the drop downs of the system, do you want this person to only be able to see their records? Do you want them to see only people they manage, their peers and their subordinates, or when they're clicking the drop downs, do you want them to see everybody in Tracker? So this is where you can put some layers to the drop downs in the system, so you can make it so they can't see others. Now linked candidate is where you can link a user to a candidate record on the system. If you click the drop down, it would show your candidates that are already on the system if you wanted to link the user to a particular candidate. Now if we go down, this is going to be one of the most important boxes. This is where you can say I want this to be a licensed user. If there isn't a license available, you would see this grayed out. And then under the configuration section, this is where you can say I want them to appear in sales user drop-down lists. If they're going to be using the project portion of Tracker, you can also say I want them to be in project drop-downs. The ticketing portion isn't going to be one of the things you guys are going to use. Extract parser user account only. What this does is if you have an email address or something where you're trying to only give it the ability to parse in information and it's not a user, that's where you would use this. But if it's a normal user on the account, you wouldn't select that. And then the last option for edit message board messages just allows this person to edit things that are popping onto the message board, which would show up here. On the bottom right-hand side, you can indicate the territory. Now it is set, this is a default to United States. The startup territory, if there are multiples, this is where you can say what territory you want them to start up into, whether it's a specific one or all. Time zone is where you can set the time zone out to the specific time zone that this user will be in. And then business unit and team, this is where you can build out specific business units if there is a need to. You can put in an employee number or a cost center for each particular user. So if we go out and hit save and continue, we'll now have the user created on the system. You'll see that a user ID is assigned, and now we can go and add any additional information on here. So on the left-hand side, you'll see we have all of our additional tabs where we can configure the details for this user. Before we look at those, one of the most important things and one of the most commonly overlooked items is going to be the touch bar. So if we hit the touch bar, this is where you can send a template or an email out. You can also send the welcome email, which is going to be a system template that will send out the username, the password, and the login to Tracker to the email address that's been entered. You can hit set user password if you want to reset it from the default password, which is the word welcome. You can also tick the box at the very bottom to force that user to change their password on their next login. You can also send a password reminder. You can lock a user. You can unlock a user. You can terminate their session if you have somebody that has left the company, or if you're worried that somebody's credentials have been taken, you can terminate the session. And then you can also create an associated candidate record from this particular user. So that's how you can send out the information and set any passwords or reset any information. So if we hit return to users now, and we look at our table of users, we now have our initial license, and we have our second user that we have built out. So we'll see that he's in the recruiter user group, and now he has an allocated license, so it has 2 out of 2 that's being shown. So here under the user table is also where you can go in and you can edit any of the information for that user if there's anything you need to change, or if you need to use the touch bar to reset a password, send anything out, or action anything out in here. So the next thing we'll take a look at is some of the settings down the left-hand side. So now that we've set all the general details for the user, you can go into the mail settings, and this is where you have the option of using our servers, which would send the email from TrackerRMS's servers, and it would be on behalf of your email address. Or if you want to use your own custom mail server, you would need to go down and click on the custom mail server dropdown. The SMTP box is where you would enter in your details. So if it was something like Office 365, it would look something like this. The outgoing server port is typically a 3-digit number. Sometimes it's 2. These would be details that you would want to get from your email provider or your internal IT. The account name is where you would put in the email address. And then the password is where you would enter in your password for that particular email account. The box lets you indicate whether TLS or SSL security is required. And then when you hit the blue button, it would let you know whether that has been successful or not. So here, since this is just fake information that I entered in, it'll take just a couple of seconds for that test to go through, and it will let you know that there was an error connecting to the mail server. So there's a number of information that's in here, but typically if you're seeing a green message, it is letting you know that the details are incorrect for the username and password. If you're seeing a red message, it's typically letting you know that the server information is incorrect. When this is successful, you would see it pop up an alert that says this email has been successfully configured, and it would also send a test email into that particular account. So this is where you can set up the email details. There is also a PDF down here that goes over some basics of the mail settings. The next one down below is setting up an email signature. So this is where as a default, it pulls through the name and title, but you can go in here and clear this out. And this is where an email signature can be added using the built-in editor. So if we wanted to build out an email signature here, the one thing you'll notice is if you hit return, it will go 2 spaces. If you hold the shift button and hit enter, it will go down 1 row. So this is where you can enter in any information that you wanted to build out a signature. Now you can also use the built-in editor up here to drop in any type of images from the image library. So here, if you had an image that you wanted to put into the signature line, you could load it up and bring in that image. If you wanted to upload a new one, you can also do it right from here. Copy and pasting an image won't work in the signature line. It will need to be added into the image library using the link here. You also have the insert or edit link, which is where if you wanted to change something into a hyperlink, you can select it. You can go up and change that into a link, and you could say we want this to become a website. You can also display the text. If you hit OK, it will turn that into a link. So the email signature can be used just by using the simple editor here, and then you can hit Save Changes to save in that email signature that will pop up on any activities in the system. The next one down below is going to be alerts and subscriptions. So this is where you can set up alerts for this particular user. It's driven by their favorite records, and then you can choose whether you want alerts when any changes are made or when activities or notes are added. You can also choose it to be by a home page or a notification by email. The activities section is going to show all the activities that the user has been entered in. Targets is where you can set up sales targets and revenue targets for that particular user. These can be built out just by selecting the contract. If we wanted to assign a sales target for value of $100,000, and we wanted to assign a volume of 30 placements, we could enter that in. And what it's going to do is it would split out those targets across the entire year for that particular user. You can do it by both sales, value, volume, and then you can also set revenue targets if you're tracking revenue versus sales. The job board section, which is going to be the next one below, this is where you can configure the job boards. If there are any job boards that you are searching from and you've purchased the Daxtra integration, this is where you would just need to select that job board from the dropdown. For instance, if we were setting up DICE, you would click on DICE, you would enter in your username, your password, hit OK, and it would drop in the details for that job board. The telephony tab is if there is a telephone integration. Security is where you can put in IP registrations, where you can have either a fixed IP range or you can make it so they have to register any IP addresses that aren't recognized. And then user aliases, which is the bottom one, is where we can go in and add aliases if there are secondary email addresses that you're wanting to be able to send from rather than just the primary email address. So that's all of the basics of the user in the system. Now the next thing we'll take a look at is the user groups and privileges. So we have the admin and the recruiter user group, and we've assigned our new user into our recruiter user group. So if there's any changes or if you want to double check the user groups that have been set up, you can go down into the user groups option here. And this is where we can look at our admin and our recruiter user groups to make any changes if we wanted to make a change to that particular user group. So here we have it named, and we also have the layout that's used for that user group. Under the Tools access, this is where we can choose when they click the Tools button, what will they see? So you can uncheck this if you want it to be blank, or you can have a few options in here. The Privileges section is where you can choose what you want them and don't want them to be able to do. So for instance, if we didn't want them to be able to add new records on the system, you could uncheck that. If we didn't want them to be able to edit charge rates or assign ownership, we could uncheck any of these to change that information. And then tab access is where if we wanted to remove any of the main tabs of the system from their view, you can uncheck it so they wouldn't see those main tabs. And then within the records themselves, you can remove the tab blocks that they have access to just by unchecking those tab blocks as well. The reporting tab is where you can choose, do I want them to be able to have access to particular folders? And of course, you can remove the reporting section itself so they wouldn't be able to see anything in there. So the other thing that you may want to do if there are multiple users and the need for additional user groups is you can always add a new user group, or you can open up the user group and you can hit the clone button to clone the user group so you're not having to set up everything from scratch, and then you can just change, add, or remove any specifics that are different from that one. So if we go back to Tools and look at our user setup section, we're also going to have the licenses option. What this section does is it gives you all of your users in a view where you can tick or untick them as a licensed user. So it is a way that you can make multiple changes at once. We also have our user targets, and this is where you can set up targets in bulk by accessing all of the people from this particular view instead of needing to go into each of their records. The other thing you'll be able to do here is, so first you'll want to make sure you click the drop down of the user from here. So if I click on my Academy user, you'll see that the screen will refresh and I'll have my sales and revenue targets, which we had just loaded in. But if we click the drop down, we can also assign activity KPIs, which will light up the meters that will be on the home page for your scorecard. So we'll go ahead and look at our Academy user, which is the license that we're logged in as now. And if you wanted to load in any of those KPIs, this is where you can add in activity targets from here. So if I hit add new target, I could say for placements, I want it to start January 1st, and I want it to be 1 placement a week is what our KPI or our goal is. If I hit OK, that would drop in that particular target. Now you will see that you'll have to hit the refresh button here to see those as you're placing them in. But now I could build out any additional KPIs or targets that I wanted to put in. So if next I wanted to look at resume sents, and I wanted to make sure that we have 5 resumes we send a week, I could set that up. So you'll see these targets will build out as we go. And what this is doing is if you go onto your home page and look at My Scorecard, anywhere where you're assigning a target, you're going to see it's going to turn from no target set into a meter that would show your activities in real time. You would see them bounce up against the target. The scorecard filters is where we can go in and we can say I want to look at an entire month. I can look at a particular user, or I can look at an all user view to see all users on my system. So that's where you can set up those targets for each individual user from the user target section. Again, the one thing that sometimes hangs people up a little bit is if you go to activity KPIs first, you're not going to see anything. You would need to first, before you do anything, select the user. And then when we go down to that activity KPI section, you would see those targets start to build out. You can hit the trash button to delete them, and then of course add any additional targets on that you want. So if we go back into the tools section, our user option is where we went into. For buy user licenses, this is also the same link that you would see where you can click this to buy any additional licenses. So let's go back into the user section and take a look at if we wanted to delete access to a user. So let's say Academy user was somebody we wanted to delete off the system. So there's a number of different things you can do. So one, if this was somebody that was on leave and we didn't want them to use the license, but they potentially were coming back, We could go in and untick the license. I can hit save and close, and it would take me back to my users, and you would see that now we have an additional license available. So I could add a new user and have a second active seat on here. The other one would sit there, and it wouldn't be available to use, but you could leave them on the system in case they were ever coming back. The other thing you can always do is to ensure that they couldn't use the system, you can go out to the touch bar and you could lock this user as well, which would lock their account. You can also hit the terminate session button to make sure that if they were in Tracker, it would kill their session. And when you return to users, you'll see that there's now a padlock next to that particular user's name. So you can leave them on there. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is if this was somebody you wanted to delete, you can go into the record and you can hit the delete this user button. So it won't delete their data that's on the system. Their data will all still be there and available. If I pulled a record that they owned, you would see it would show a footprint that Academy user owned that record, but they wouldn't appear in any drop-down lists moving forward if you put a new candidate or a new job on. So if this person I wanted to delete, I can delete the user, which is going to delete them off the system, but it would keep anything that they've logged in the system for you to have access to see. So that's how we can delete a user. That's also how we can lock them and how we can add a user. So that takes us through the user setup. Next in admin lesson 2, we're going to go over application settings on the system.